All right, we're going to talk about boost control. With boost control, we have two types in the software. There's open loop and closed loop. If we go up to the boost menu and boost control settings, this initial area here is all about setup with the normal single solenoid and which output it uses. And for this ECU, it's injector out I. That's what connects to the boost control solenoid, at least the original one over on the passenger side valve cover. We have the algorithm set to open loop. There's some settings here for the minimum and maximum duty cycle and when to allow it to start controlling by coolant. So if you don't want the boost to come on, or at least be at its minimum, below a certain coolant temperature, you can set that there. The factory boost control in the Grand National was open loop. The computer didn't know what the boost was. It just pulsed the solenoid at a certain duty cycle to achieve a certain boost, and it was programmed from the factory that way. And when you went into the higher gears, like third and fourth gear, it would drop down to a slightly lower duty cycle to reduce boost. So with this ECU, when you have it set in an open loop, there's going to be basically this table. This is a percentage, this is duty cycle that the boost solenoid will pulse at. And whenever, well, always based on what this table is set up to. The I have the first couple cells at 0 just so it doesn't pulse at sitting at idle, something like that. So I just have them set at 0. But the rest of the table is at 50%. So when you floor it, the boost solenoid is going to be pulsing at 50%, and you'll get a certain boost level that correlates with that duty cycle. Now you might ask, well, how do I know what boost level that's going to be? Well, you don't. It's trial and error. So you're going to want to start lower. So you can select the whole table and set it to 20% duty cycle, for example, and go out and make a run. And you always want to come up on boost slow with your foot to make sure it doesn't go nuts on you. But start low, and if at 20% it's only at 10 psi, then you go to 30% and try it again. And you just keep going up until you get to a level that is the level that you want to run. You want to run at. So, for example, I wanted to run at about 17 or 18 psi, and I ended up right around 50%, and that's basically where it would hang, was around 17 or 18 psi. But like I said, that's open loop. It can't correct. It could creep up a little or creep down a little, and things like that. So a lot of people want to use closed loop boost control, and I'll go over that here in a second. But as far as open loop, like the factory did it, this is how you do it. There is one other thing you can add here, and you can change what that duty cycle is based on speed or gear. Sometimes I'll do it by mile per hour. So you turn that to VSS1, which is the speed sensor, and you might set this to say over 50%. And when you turn that to VSS, when you make that change, another table will appear right here called the boost control versus speed. So if we turn that on, we see that the bottom is mile per hour, and you can set that up however you want. And the top is the duty cycle. You can see I still had it at 50%. And what I did was, at 61 miles an hour, it drops to 45 when it hits 63. So I have these close together so that I get a pretty quick ramp where it drops down to. And I did the same thing for first to second gear, which is around 35. And so, for example, if I set this higher, let's put it to 60%, you can see in first gear, as long as you're over 50% throttle position, the solenoid will pulse at 60%. And then when it shifts into second, on this particular car, This might be different for your car. It'll drop to 50%, this range right here. And then when it shifts into third, it'll drop to 45%. So this might drop boost, say, another 1 psi, when you go into third gear. So you can modify the boost, even in open loop, you can modify it by speed or gear. That would be pretty much exactly like the factory did it on the original car. So a lot of people are going to want to use closed loop boost control. Now closed loop, it will actually look at the boost level and try and make corrections and hold the boost level that you programmed. The tables will change when you make that closed loop. You're going to get a boost target table, and this is in kPa, so you need to convert. It's absolute pressure. And the boost control bias table. And basically what that is it's similar to the duty cycle table we had before. This is the starting point. This is when it goes into closed loop, where do we start at? We have to have a starting point. In this case, we're going to start at 50%. So I'm going to show you, whoops, sorry about that. Let me turn that back to off. The simplest method. This is just still using just one boost control solenoid, like the factory wastegate was set up, and this was with an internal wastegate, much like a stock turbo. I had the boost target set at 220, and like I said, that's in kPa, which is about 17.5. Matter of fact, let's take some notes here. For closed loop boost control, we're going to want to know the target boost in kPa. All right, so 220, that's about 17 or 18 psi. So to make it simple, we just took the whole table and changed it to made it 220 kPa. This axis is throttle position, and this is RPM. I didn't set up this axis specifically yet because I had the whole table set the same. Obviously, we don't need a 200 and a 400 and 600, 800. This could probably be 1,000 to 6,000, or even higher. You could probably start at 2,000 and go up from there by just clicking on it and changing the value. But since they're all the same in this case, it doesn't matter. So the target is 220. And then we have to have a place for it to start. Now, as far as the starting point, you may, if you previously had it in open loop mode and you know that right around 50% worked for your car, then you can start there. If you haven't done anything yet, there's another mode called setup mode. And setup mode is basically just like the basic closed loop mode, but it just doesn't turn on closed loop. Let me show you. I'm going to bring up a log right here. Okay, this was a log I did with my car. I'm showing the map reading. I'm showing the target boost. You can see it's 220. And this is the duty cycle of the boost solenoid. Here I have throttle position, which technically isn't critical at this point. I'm showing boost in PSI just for reference, and mile per hour just so I can see where we're at. But so if I come through this log, and this was in closed loop, I started to get on the throttle. You see it comes up to 40%. And the way the closed loop method works is it will take the boost duty cycle straight to 100% as soon as you hit about 100 to 101 map. So as soon as you transition, 100 is right where you transition into boost. That would be 0 psi. So as soon as you transition into boost, it will force the duty cycle to 100%, and that's to get the fastest spool up you possibly can. So you can see it stays at 100% as I step through the log, and then it drops down to the 50% area. So if you're going to use setup mode, well, in this case, if I kept stepping through the log, you'll see that the duty cycle, it starts going up because it's in closed loop. It's trying to meet a certain target. If you're going to use setup mode, it will do the exact same thing. It won't do any corrections after the fact. So it's a good way to start is to start it in setup mode, and that way you can play with the bias table to see where your boost goes. Also, we need to know when, let me go back to the log here. We need to know when to go into closed loop. That's when it drops down. You'll see it's at 100 and then it drops down. That's when it enters closed loop. We need to know when to enter closed loop. So we need a target, we need to know when to go into closed loop, and we need to know what the bias should be. When you're using setup mode, you're going to do like I explained earlier with open loop boost control. Basically, you're going to move the bias up and down until the boost is close to what you want it to be. In this case, I was shooting for 17 or 18 psi. Now, the other thing is, when I would talk about when to enter closed loop, that is set up with this setting right here. Let me bring this over. Boost control lower limit delta. And basically what you would do is take the target boost level, or whatever you would put in the table, 220, and you would subtract from that to establish when to enter closed loop. And that way, if you take the target up higher, that turn on point will kind of move along with it. So in this case, I had it set at 50 kPa. So if you take 220 minus 50, you get 170 kPa. And that is, if you creep up on this part of the log, it's at 100% and it gets to about 170. I don't have the resolution set that high. Let me zoom in just a little bit. Okay. In any case, at 170, it will drop down to that 50% level. Now, that's an important part of boost setup because that can change whether you have a huge boost spike or the boost comes up too slow. You can see the way that the boost came up right here, or even down here in PSI. You can see that it came up and it spiked a little bit. It wasn't too bad. It came up to about 18 PSI or 225 kPa, and then it came back down more into the 220 range. There's 218. If I would have dropped it into closed loop later, like right now I have it set dropping into closed loop at about 170, but if I had it set to 200 or even real close, maybe I set it to 220 thinking, hey, that's what I want. I just want to go right into closed loop as soon as I hit my target. It would likely overboost badly because there's inertia in the turbo wheel and other factors involved where the turbo is going to want to just keep going and it'll overboost. So you can experiment with moving this point when it drops into closed loop back and forth. Now, if I had it way too early and I had it drop into closed loop much too soon in here, then you would see the boost start off a little lower, and instead of being a spike here, it would be kind of a dip. It would be down this way and take too long to get up to boost. So we need to know the target. In this case, I picked 220. So we have that. We go into the boost control settings. We need to know when to enter closed loop. I had it set at 50 kPa. Don't set this up so that it goes below 100. In other words, 220 to get down to 100, you would have to subtract 120. That if you would set that to 120, then that would the delta would be, it would trying to go into closed loop right at 100 kPa, which we don't want. So maybe start at by subtracting maybe 80 or so and creep up on it because we want it to come up slow. So in this case, I ended up at about 50. So we got the target. We have when to enter closed loop, which is 50, 50 less than the target. And then from previous experimentation, I learned that 50% duty cycle was a good place to start in my case. So I got on the gas. The duty cycle went to 100%. When I reached the closed loop threshold, it went into closed loop, which immediately put the boost duty cycle at 50%. And now it's going to just monitor the boost and make corrections. And so it held, you can see the actual map was around 220 here and the target was 220, so it didn't really need to increase my duty cycle that much at all here. But as I get further into the run, you can see the map drops, the boost is dropping, and so the ECU is now adding boost duty cycle. That's the yellow line. It's adding to try and bring the boost back up. Now, how fast it makes that correction is set here. Well, I still have it in setup mode. So let me go back to setup mode. You would use setup mode to sort of establish, to get yourself in the ballpark of where you wanted to be, like I mentioned earlier, as far as what bias to use. And then you would put it into closed loop. And I have been using basic mode. And what that does is just gives you one slider here to change the sensitivity. And with this log that I made, it added duty cycle a little on the slow side. So I would probably go back and turn the sensitivity up. This sensitivity was at 150. Maybe I'll go up to 180 and make another run and see if it makes the correction a little bit quicker. Again, it's trial and error. You have to experiment with it because it's going to depend on what type of solenoid you're using, whether you're using the stock solenoid, whether you're using an aftermarket like a Mac valve, and things like that. Now, one thing about this minimum and maximum duty cycle, in this case, I left it at 0 and 100. Sometimes for safety's sake, if you want to make sure that the boost doesn't get out of control, maybe you want to set it at some lower number, like 60 or something like that. Just in case, it just make sure that the duty cycle can't go straight to 100% during the run and cause some issues. But if you want to change the boost target, like we talked about earlier, by mile per hour or gear, you can turn that on and set a throttle position above which you want it to apply these changes, and boost control versus speed will appear just like the open loop, but instead of duty cycle, it'll be the target kPa. And so this is set up like I had before with the first kind of around first gear and the 2 to 3 gear shift, and so that's how you change the target for that. But so this is the simple starting point for closed loop boost control. This assumes you have a single solenoid set up sort of like the factory, that it bleeds off pressure from the wastegate itself. and these are the pieces of information you need to look at. What's your target, when to enter closed loop, and like I said, that's subtracted from target, and which is right here, which is called the delta. So that's subtracted from the target. And the bias, which is the starting point. There's a lot of trial and error with boost control. It's not, just don't think it's easy. You can just set a boost level and it's going to go there. Be safe and start with things on the low side and work your way up. And then when you get everything into range, it'll work pretty good for you. There are other ways to control the boost. I'm not going to get into with this particular video. They have to do with when you launch. You can ramp in the boost if you want to, but something like that usually requires an external wastegate and like a CO2 bottle, so you can get a wider range of control over the boost. This setup here that I just outlined is more for a simple, like an internal gate stock style. So we'll start there and see how that goes.